Hi everyone, this is Evan at Stryd, and welcome back to another episode of the Stryd Power podcast. It's January 1st, 2020. Hope you're having a great start to the new year. We're really excited to bring more content as we start this new year. Really excited to talk more about how you can learn about how to use Stryd, more scientific-based literature, more interviews, and more helpful tips from us at Stryd. Very excited to start this new year out with more content. The episode today, I want to talk about two articles from Hans and Ron from The Secret of Running. You may have read their book. You might have no idea that there is a book called The Secret of Running. It is one of my favorite books to constantly refer back to in my own training and just looking at how to use Stryd data in a practical manner. I believe that the book is very scientifically backed. I really enjoy the deep dive into it, but then on the surface level, I find that I can learn a lot of information from it. So you can definitely go to our website and get the book. You can search for The Secret of Running. And then just search for Stryd along with it, and it'll take you right there. But I have two articles that I want to talk through because I think they're actually very helpful for understanding how Stryd data relates not only in your training and your racing, but helps you understand just how to use, the data that's coming from this foot pod that you put on your foot and you run with. So the first article is the close relationship between Stryd and VO2 max. So how do you find your VO2 max just by using Stryd data? Well, Hans and Ron are going to tell you based off some scientific research they've done. Recently, they carried out a new research project in cooperation with the physiological laboratory of Professor Maria Hopman of the Radboud University in Netherlands. A full scientific paper on the project had been submitted to Journal of Sports Science and Medicine. In order to share their results with the running community at large, they wrote 4 short, popular papers on the main findings of 1, the close relationship between Stryd Power and VO2. Number 2, the impact of speed on running economy. Number 3, the impact of cadence on the running economy. And number 4, the physiological differences between trained and untrained runners. So the first topic that we are going to talk about, I am going to talk about, is the close relationship between Stryd Power and VO2. You can go to blog.stryd.com to read this article in full. I cannot talk the pictures and the illustrations that are in the article, so I'd really highly suggest, if this short podcast does interest you, definitely go to blog.stryd.com. Just look for the Stryd and VO2 article, and you'll be able to view kind of the visualizations that come along with this article. So starting the article off, this project included measuring the VO2 in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute and Stryd Power in watts per kilogram. There were 21 runners, 11 trained and experienced distance runners, and 10 untrained students. There were 5 different speeds that were run, maintained during 3 minutes, increasing in 4 steps of 1 kilometer an hour. This means that there was a total of 105 data points of VO2 and power. The figure below shows the database, so you should 100% go and look at this figure because it's super cool. I really like it. Shows the really cool data overlaid on a table. The correlation between VO2 and Stryd Power is quite impressive, and even more so when we realize that the data points represent a heterogeneous set of runners who are trained and untrained and test conditions, low speed all the way up to their lactate threshold speed. Hans and Ron write, this confirms our earlier findings that the daily Stryd Power data can be used very well to provide an alternative for the once-a-year determination of the VO2 max in a physiological laboratory. Here's some other really interesting findings from this article. The first being trained runners need less oxygen to produce the same wattage. A striking result is that they found the most of the scatter in the data can be eliminated when we divide our test runners into 2 groups. For example, trained and untrained. Trained runners need about 4% less oxygen, so they have a somewhat lower VO2 in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute at the same power in watts per kilogram. This means that their metabolic efficiency must be higher. In the blog, they have a formula for their metabolic efficiency. I'm not going to read through it because I don't want to complicate anything, but they say that the energy yield of oxygen, which can be approximated at 19 joules per milliliter of oxygen, goes along in this equation. That's important to know. And so the result from the equation that they give is a metabolic efficiency of 22%. The reason that this is important to know is that the figure in the blog shows the untrained runners had a metabolic efficiency close to 23%, whereas the trained runners were 4% more efficient with a metabolic efficiency close to 24%. The two lines, when you break these untrained and trained runners up into groups, closely match the data. We note that most of the remaining scatter between the data points is caused by differences in speed. They mention that this leads to a change in the fuel mix, which is less fatty acids and more glycogen as your speed increases, and the energy yield. Consequently, the VO2 at low speeds tends to be relatively high, the reverse in the case at high speeds. So the title of this, or something referring to it, that probably drew you in, was how to calculate your VO2 from your Stryd Power data, because this is a super interesting thing to learn a little bit more about your running. Hans and Ron note that the trained runners were experienced distance runners with many years of training. However, they were not at the elite level. This is important because in the blog post, there is going to be the full formula, which is just multiplying the number by the certain power that you have based off your running tests. And I don't necessarily want to talk through the whole thing. I'll give you a quick snippet here, saying untrained runners, their VO2 equals 13.73 times their watts per kilogram. Trained runners, VO2 equals 13.16 times watts per kilogram. Elite athletes, VO2 equals 12.63 times watts per kilogram. You don't have to write this down. You can just go to blog.stryd.com and look at your data side by side with this formula. The above formulas approximate the VO2 for all power ranges. In order to estimate your VO2 max, you should use the power that you can maintain during 10 minutes, is what Hans and Ron write. So I would really encourage you, if you are interested on how to calculate your VO2 from your Stryd Power data, definitely go to blog.stryd.com and look for the article called How to Use Stryd Power to Calculate Your VO2. Second part of this podcast, quick podcast, is going to talk about how much the wind impacts your 5K time. And this is one of the reasons that I absolutely love The Secret of Running book. In the book, they refer constantly back to somebody they call their marathon man. It's a imaginary figure that has a set weight, has a set running speed, has a set energy availability, and he goes through the ringer of all these sample equations and all these experiments that they talk about of different conditions, different terrain, different physiological performances, and it helps you understand how the math and the science that goes into getting all this data, how it actually works and how it can actually help you. So this is going to be kind of an example of it, because we're going to use one of the authors as kind of our guide for figuring out how much the wind impacts your 5K time. So the article here, this is again from the guys at Secret of Running, Hans and Ron, say there is a worldwide hunt in the search for options to optimize running performance through reducing the air resistance among runners, coaches, and running scientists. Cyclists and speed skaters have been doing this for a long time already by developing optimal aerodynamic conditions such as clothing, frames, body position, streamlining, drafting. In running, there have been a few breakthroughs in capturing air resistance recently. The first came with the development of the new Stryd, which reports air power additional to power in real time. The second was the sensational Ineos 159 challenge. In Vienna, Eliud Kipchoge was helped by 41 pacers, 5 teams of 7 pacers and 6 reserves, to achieve his magnificent 159 40 for 26.2 miles. In this paper, we will calculate concretely and exactly how big the impact of the wind speed and the wind direction is on the running speed. As an example, we'll use the author Hans, who weighs 58 kilograms and can run a 5K race time in 18 minutes. So in the book Secret of Running, they discuss the theory of air resistance in many, many chapters. According to the fundamental laws of physics, the power required to surmount the air resistance, which is PA, air power, is determined by the density of air, the air resistance factor called CDA, the running speed, and the wind speed. So I'll go over this again. The things that go into calculating air power are the density of the air. That's important to know. The air factor or air resistance factor, CDA, that's important to know. The running speed, that's important to know, and the wind speed. So that's what goes into air power. First, we're going to assume for this equation that Hans ran his time of 18 minutes in quote-unquote ideal conditions, so no wind. The wind equals 0. Consequently, his air resistance power will have been equal to 14 watts in the standard conditions at his running speed. So 5,000 meters in 18 minutes is 4.63 meters per second. His running power would have been equal to 263 watts in this example. So you might ask, okay, how big is the impact of the wind on the air resistance? Actually, I want to back up really quick because I find if I talk through things a little too quickly, I might skip ahead and not make sense as much. In the previous sentence here said, consequently, his air resistance power would have been equal to 14 watts. And this is something that you could see with the new Stryd. You have your running time, you have your running speed, and with ideal conditions, meaning the wind, the headwind equals 0, there's going to be 14 extra watts of air resistance. And this is fully explained if you read the book Secret of Running. But just assuming that his running speed is 4.63 meters per second, he covers 5,000 meters in 18 minutes. That gets him his 263 watts. How big is the impact of the wind on air resistance? So now that we've calculated the air resistance power at 2, 8, 16 meters per second. This is, again, in the book and in the blog post. There's a full chart that shows, from very, very little headwind all the way up to a 16 meters per second wind, which is incredibly high. That is very, very high, as we'll see in this example. For both a headwind and a tailwind, we'll see with a headwind, the power from air resistance increases from 14 watts all the way to 131 watts, which is almost half the total power of 277 watts from Hans. At a tailwind, the air power decreases from 14 watts to negative 86 watts, which the negative value indicates he literally gets a push in the back from wind. So what is the impact of these examples on his race time? The running power decreases as the headwind increases and vice versa with the tailwind. For his specific race time with these extreme examples, an 18-minute 5K, if you have a 16 meters a second headwind, increases to 32 minutes for a 5K. The race time, if he was running still that 18-minute power, so that power that wattage that he was outputting for that 18 minutes in perfectly calm conditions, if he had that massive tailwind of 16 meters a second, it would take him just over 13 minutes to run the 5K. And so I don't necessarily think that having the numbers referring to the table here is going to help as much as it would for you to maybe if you've run a recent race and you're kind of curious about, what if I was running into a 16 meters per second headwind or tailwind, kind of those fun numbers to play around with. The Secret of Running site, their website has a calculator for that. But then also you can go to the blog.stryd.com and look at the effect of wind on your 5K time post, and you can read through that full formula there. So in real running conditions, this is another reason again, like I said earlier, why I really enjoy their write-ups from Hans and Ron, but also the book, is that they put things into practical terms, because they write that in real running conditions, we never experience a headwind or tailwind during the whole race. It's never a perfectly like wind tunnel-esque headwind and tailwind. It's always going to have a little bit of a crosswind, so they think it's relevant, so they look at crosswinds too. The formulas become more complicated, and I'm not going to read through the full math here, because they write the result is a sixth order polynomial, and then I'm done there. I don't necessarily want to have to read out everything there too. You can definitely go to the blog and read the full formula. If you come up with a imaginary scenario of that same exact 18-minute 5K time, you have 1K with a headwind, 1K with a crosswind at 45 degrees, 1K with a crosswind of 90 degrees, 1K with a crosswind of 135 degrees, and 1K with a tailwind. It leads to a race time of 21:39, so more than 3 minutes slower than no wind at all. Again, in those perfect conditions. So I would definitely encourage you to look at the blog and look at their site and kind of play around with the calculator there, because it's pretty fun just to say, oh, I had this goal half marathon and I was super excited. I was really fit, and I ran a really good race in terms of power. I hit my goal, but what would it have been like if I had a 10 meters a second tailwind behind me? How fast could I have run? So that's kind of the fun stuff that you can play around with there. The closing statement here from Hans and Ron is that they feel the above calculations provide ample arguments to use the new Stryd. At Stryd